The biggest experience in it wasn't in her death. It's what that led to, which sort of happened 24 hours later.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and welcome to the No Filter podcast, where you get to take a peek into the life of someone pretty remarkable who has a big story to tell. There's this house in Sydney that's a few suburbs away from where I live, and every time I've driven past it or parked near it over the last 30 years, I've stopped for a moment to reflect. I always look up at that house, and it always takes me back, and not in a good way. Because inside that house, a woman was murdered, and at the time, I was at school with her 3 daughters. Her name was Marguerite Edwards, and her death affected not just her devastated family, but an entire community. And for a long time, nobody knew who had killed her. A little while ago, I walked up to the front door of that house, feeling very apprehensive, and I knocked on the door, and the man who opened it and greeted me warmly was Dr. Iain Edwards, Margie's husband, and the father of the girls I went to school with, Sky, Camilla, and Brianna. They weren't in my year, but I knew who they were. They were a bit younger than me. And for a long time, Iain Edwards was actually the subject of some very ugly rumours about his wife's death back in 1989. The day Margie died began like any other day in his family, really. They woke up, they got their daughters ready for school. Iain headed off to work at his orthodontist clinic that was around a 5-minute drive up the road from where they lived. And Margie dropped the girls at high school, and she went to an aerobics class because it was the 80s after all. By all accounts, everything in the Edwards family was very, very normal that day. But at 6 p.m. that night, Iain got a panicked phone call from his neighbour. Margie hadn't picked up the girls from school. She was one of the other mothers, and she'd seen them waiting, and she'd collected them and brought them home. They lived just next door. And when she'd gone to the house to check on her friend, she'd found the front door open and blood visible on the carpet. Iain raced home after that phone call in a panic. He entered his house and he walked up the stairs directly to their bedroom. And that's where he found his precious wife lying on the floor. At just 41, Margie Edwards had been murdered, and life as Iain and his girls knew it really did change forever. As I said, I went to school with Iain's daughters, and I remember that day with such crystal clarity. I also remember the day, perhaps even more vividly, later that week, when Iain came to the school and spoke at assembly, and he said, "Please don't be afraid of my family. Don't avoid us," he said. "We need you." And what he said stuck with me so much. And last year when I was interviewing Lee Sales for her book, Any Ordinary Day, I retold what Iain had told us all those years ago, because we were talking about people who had lost loved ones and how sometimes people get really uncomfortable around them and they don't know what to say, and so they end up avoiding them, and how that can really compound the grief and the sense of isolation and loss. Little did I know that Iain's daughter Brianna was listening to that interview that I did with Lee, and she reached out via email and said that she thought that it was time I spoke with her father. And soon afterwards, I was knocking on the door of his house to record this podcast. And the first thing I noticed when I entered the house, very nervously, was how calm it was. I don't usually record No Filter interviews outside the Mamma Mia studio, but I wanted Iain to feel comfortable, and he wanted me to come and see the haven that he had created in large part as a tribute to his wife, who he is clearly still so very much in love with. Iain is a remarkable man. He's a retired orthodontist, a grandfather, and a person with a lot of stories to tell, including the way they found out who it was that had killed Margie so many years after she died. Iain's never remarried since Margie's death, and he's never even had a serious partner. I always had assumed or hoped that he had. But he's not unhappy. In fact, far from it. He has actually been on a quest since her death to find out what love actually is. Iain welcomed me and my producer Liz into his home, and we sat in his living room by a crackling fire, because it was a cold and rainy day, to have this conversation. You might hear the fire in the background. And just a warning, if you have little ears around, if you haven't worked this out by now, Iain describes what happened on that day that his life changed. So maybe it's not the best one for little ears. Here is the remarkable Iain Edwards. I was nervous about coming here because I've imagined this house for 30 years.
Yes.
And I thought that it might have a different energy to the one that it has.
Now, that's really interesting because we had the same problem after Marguerite's death about whether we would come back into the house thinking it would be so traumatic and it wouldn't feel right. But there was some sort of experience which I would call an epiphany that I had in the house the next day after her death, which radically changed the energy level in the house. And nobody has ever come into the house in the last 30 years and ever said, the house doesn't feel good. I know exactly what you mean. You go into some places and they feel negative, spooky, unhomely, unloved. Maybe it's the amount of work we put in the house to make it the way it is, and the house responds. It's got consciousness as well. So I think all that works to make the ambient feeling that you get in a place. And so there's no negativity here now. You can walk through the place and you won't feel anything.
Walking back into the house on that first day, do you remember much about it?
Looking back at what happened it's now 30 years ago, I remember exactly what happened. I know that sounds a bit unusual, but the event was so huge that it's sort of like indelibly imprinted in my mind exactly what happened. You know, it was a normal day. I went to work as normal, and Marguerite went about her things theoretically as normal. The kids went to school, so all that was normal until I was working back at the surgery, and my neighbour from next door rang up at 6 o'clock and said she'd picked up the children because Marguerite hadn't picked them up at school, which was unusual. She'd taken them home. She'd gone into the house and found a chair turned over and decided to leave, so she'd left the house, taken the children next door to her home and rung me. And that's what she told me over the telephone. The extraordinary thing at that moment when she rings me is I get this realisation, feeling, knowingness, thought, like feeling of truth going through, and I get this thought, she's dead. And I'm sitting at the surgery at 6 o'clock, and my neighbour's just rung and said, she hasn't seen Marguerite, and I say to myself, she's dead. And I knew that was real. It was just like the most powerful truth that I'd ever experienced. Why I should think that, I don't know, because, you know, maybe she was unconscious on a floor somewhere, or she wasn't dead. But there was just this feeling that she was dead. So I said, right, I'll come home. And so I hung up the phone, picked up my bag, and drove home in the car, all the while saying to myself, she's dead, she's dead, she's dead. And I remember sitting at the traffic lights in Queen Street, which were red, and I was blocked there and we couldn't get through the traffic stream, and sitting, thinking there, oh my God, she's dead, she's dead, she's dead. So when I walked into the house at 6 o'clock, I knew she was dead, but I didn't have to sort of ask the question, is she dead or where is she? I knew she was dead. And I walked straight into the house, walked straight up to the bedroom. I could have gone anywhere out the back of the house, downstairs, into any other room. But I walked straight into the bedroom, walked straight into the room. She was lying on the floor, walked across, picked up her hand, no pulse, put her hand down and said she's dead. And that was it. It was confirming what I knew. And then I thought, I have to speak to the children there next door. So I walked out of the room to speak to the children. So the police then arrived. The neighbour had rung the police, so they then arrived as I was walking out. And I sort of thought I'd come back. So I'm not sure really what I was expecting to look at when I came back after speaking to the children. But once the police got into the place, you weren't allowed back inside, so I never got back inside. So then I went and spoke to the children. And I was at that point, I suppose that process has taken an hour from the time that I got the phone call at the surgery, got out of the surgery, drove home, went in. And I was in this sort of detached state, which obviously was some sort of shock. But at the same time, it was like there was this feeling you knew this was coming and now it's happened. And like, okay, here it is. You've been expecting this, but this is it. This is it. And so in some ways that wasn't a shock, which is a contradiction because, for the event to happen is a shock, but there's this other knowingness inside yourself that's sort of saying, well, yes, you knew this was coming.
You'd had a premonition about 6 months before when you were going for a run?
Yeah. We were going away just for the holidays, in the school holidays in July. And so I was off jogging, getting fit to cope with the holiday windsurfing. And I'm just jogging around and I start to think that she's dead. And in this case, I'm just thinking, oh, she's dead. Well, what does that mean? And I didn't get very emotional about it. And I started to sort of, oh my God, well, what if she's dead? What does that mean? And then my mind drifted into a court case and somebody was responsible and the person would go to jail for the rest of his life. And I kept on sort of jogging around thinking of this scenario. It was a bit like a play or an act, or maybe we play these premonitions about people that we love dearly, and every now and then the idea that they're not going to be there in the future comes up, and you play this out to see how you'll preempt it, as it were.
Dress rehearsing tragedy.
Dress rehearsal. So it could have been something like that. I don't know whether other people have these thoughts, oh my God, how will I survive today if my husband's dead, who I dearly love? And you play it for a while in your mind to get the idea of the feeling. So whether that's a premonition or whether it was just the thought I had at the time, I don't know. But it's coincidental. Where does that thought come from?
The court case part's pretty specific, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Somebody else was involved in her death. She just hadn't died in a car accident.
You don't strike me as a catastrophizer otherwise, because a lot of anxious people have, I won't call them premonitions, but more like fears. Someone's late home from work, oh my God, they've been in a car accident, they're dead. But you don't strike me as that kind of person.
No, I didn't. I never had any thoughts like that. But whether this was just one of the odd occasional thought you suddenly think, oh my God, if my wife dies, how will I survive? And I was playing that out, or whether it was really a subconscious bit of knowledge coming to the surface as a premonition. Who knows? But anyway, that's what happened. So in looking back at the event of Marguerite's death, the biggest experience in it wasn't in her death. It's what that led to, which sort of happened 24 hours later, when we had been evicted out of the house by the police because it's a criminal scene. And all we had was the clothes we're standing up in, and people are saying you can't go back into your home now, your kids are too young, they can't cope with that, horror, nightmares, whatever. And, as a family we discussed that, and they said, we're not giving up the house. Where else are we going to live? And that would be too traumatic to go and make a move and go somewhere else and be even more disorientated. So I decided I had to come back and see whether I could come back into the house and confront her death in the house. So 24 hours later, roughly 6 o'clock at night on the Thursday night, after hanging around in Paddington Police Station for an afternoon, being interviewed and fingerprinted and photographed and then interviewed again, and they're looking for you to make a mistake in your story. That you don't realise what they're doing. They keep interviewing you with different people. And some guy comes in and says, I'm in another department, can you just go through your story while I check the print on this? And they're looking for you to make a mistake, which you would if you were making up the story. But if you're not making up the story, you're only going to tell the same story. So, I'm telling you the same story. And then they let me go at 6 o'clock, and I walk back to the house here, and it's freezing cold, like middle of August. I walk into the house, and you said at the beginning the house feels different. Well, then I walked into the house and it was like walking into a horror movie. It was freezing. It was cold. It felt terrifying. I didn't know whether I could go on. So step by step, I sort of walked through the house and looked at things. And now I saw there was a bit of blood on the floor here, and there was blood in the kitchen, and then blood going up the stairs. So I sort of followed the trail and went back to the bedroom and was really scared. Could I go back into the bedroom? And I was really angry at that point, because the bedroom was a place of love, and here's her death in the middle of it. So I stand outside the door looking at the room, and then I walk into the room and sit on the bed and look around, and there's some blood on the carpet. And there was no signs of real sort of confrontation, furniture turned up or anything, just this blood on the floor. And I look at that, and I can see her body lying on the floor there. And then...
Do you mean you can see it in your mind, or...
No, in my mind, like I can close my eyes and see the image I saw the day before, right? And then I get hit with something like a migraine, that just explodes in my head, and the pain is just unbelievable. I can't cope, and I sort of fall onto the floor. I think I'm dying, and I fall onto the floor in this state of like a migraine times 10, and it was like electric currents going through my head, and I fall on the floor, and I think, I need help. So I turn back to the bed and adopt the classic child pose for prayer, and put my elbows on the bed, and I put my head down, and I start to pray to God. And then I think, I'm not being humble enough. This is a crazy thing to think. So I turn around and put my head down on the floor, like praying to Mecca. And I put my head down right on the floor. And at that point, I have this feeling inside me. I realise I'm absolutely beaten. There's no way out of this. There's nothing I can do, and I need help. And so I say out loud, God, I'm beaten. I can't cope with this. I'm beaten. And I was beaten. It was an admission from my heart that I was absolutely beaten. There wasn't one thing left that I could do, and I needed help. So psychologists would say that was a smashing of my ego for a few seconds there. To admit that, it wasn't from the mind that you're admitting it. It was like a total catharsis. You were just emptied inside out and giving up. You were totally beaten. And I'd never been in that situation in my life. And so I surrendered to, I use the word God, but God had to me an abstract image of divine love. I didn't see God as a personified type of image. It was this abstract intelligence, infinite love, and I'm surrendering to that. And if you're real, I'll get it. In fact, you have to be real, otherwise I can't cope. And so I'm down there on the floor in this upside down position. Now, that's interesting. Why I should adopt that position, I don't know. But in spiritual law literature, the reason you put your head on the floor is it puts your head below your heart. Your heart is higher up than your head. That's why your head's down there. So it's a sort of supreme position of supplication to something greater than you. That's why somehow or other the instinct of praying with my arms on the bed wasn't enough. I had to get down lower. And I'm down there in this sort of upside down position, saying repeatedly, I'm beaten, I'm beaten, I'm beaten, and I don't know what to do next. I'm still on the floor, and then this feeling of warmth starts to pass through me and starts to go through my body and radiates out, and suddenly I don't feel cold. Now, the house was cold, it was midwinter, there were no heaters on, I was cold, in a state of shock, so my body temperature would be down, and I'm now feeling this warmth which is radiating through me. And as I get warmer and warmer, I suddenly feel better and better, in the sense that I'm no longer beaten. And so I sort of get up and the room no longer looks negative in a sense. It looks normal. And I feel normal. The pain stopped. I feel like I'm plugged into a 2,000 volts. There's this energy running through me, and I look around and I say, it's okay, I can cope with this. We'll come back into the house. And it was like the lights turned on in the house. As I walked back down the stairs, it didn't feel negative. It felt normal again. So I went back to where the children were staying with my mother at St Ives. I said, it's okay, we're going back into the house. And so we came back the next day and moved back into the house. And I had to do some things with the children there because the kids were 10, 12 and 14. And, psychologists were saying, who'd turned up to help, oh, look, you can't have the children wandering around, et cetera, et cetera. So I said, look, don't worry, I'll handle this. So I took all the children into the bedroom, dragged them all up there on the Friday morning, and they all sat in the bed. And I said, right. I said, this is where your mother died, right there. And they all looked at me, and I said, right, you tell me what you think happened, one by one. And they said, well, somebody hit her on the head and she fell over and she died. Okay, right, Camilla? And so on. So each of them had to describe in their own words to me what they thought had happened. My idea was that they were confronting the room and what they thought had happened in the room where it happened. Eventually they said, we're sick of talking about this, Dad. It's time we went off and did something else. I said, great. Never say to me ever, you can't walk into the room. And they never did.
Did you actually know what had happened? Had you been told?
We only knew at that point she'd been hit on the head and strangled, right? So as an afterthought, she would have died from the blows to the head from brain damage. So essentially we just said, look, she'd just been hit in the head and knocked out and died. So the idea there was that we were going to confront the worst thing we could think of, was standing on the spot where she died and not run away from it, which is another reason why we came back into the house. I mean, people have bad things happen to them and then won't go near the spot. So I wasn't going to live the rest of my life avoiding driving down a street because an accident had occurred in some part of the street. And so that applied to my house. So we were going to go back and stand in the worst possible spot we could stand in to confront how we felt about that. And actually we didn't feel anything at all, which is the extraordinary thing. You don't. The fear is before you get to the spot. When you get to the spot, you actually don't feel anything.
Some people say that about anniversaries around loss as well, that the day itself is not as bad as the lead up to it.
I would agree. The anniversary of Marguerite's death, whenever it is, for 2 or 3 days beforehand, you're sort of going, oh, God, here it comes again. And then when you actually get through the day, thank God it's over. The premonition of facing up to it. So the principle was, I thought, what's the worst thing that the children and us have to do? And that is to stand in the spot where it happened. So I then took it a step further and said, right, we're all sleeping in the room tonight. And they said, oh, okay. So we all got into the bed. We had this huge double bed. And they all got into the bed and, we all went to sleep without any sort of nightmares. And we did that repeatedly until I didn't want them walking around the house saying, I'm not going upstairs because Mummy died upstairs or something. So we took the reverse attitude to what most people would do, was to sort of dive into the middle of it, which is essentially what happened in the epiphany of the night before, that the greatest fear was to go back into the room and confront what happened. So somehow I managed to do that. And when I went into that spot, the reverse occurred. Instead of being smashed by it, I was elevated by the experience I had in there.
Do you remember what happened when you came into the girls' school to speak to all the high school students?
Yes. I sort of said to the girls, there's no point staying around here, you have to go back to school. So I rang up Mrs. Danziger and I said, we're coming back. And she said, what? Like it's only yesterday. I said, well, there's no point in hanging around here. What are the girls going to do? And it's going to be harder. So I turned up the next day with the 3 girls and we sat in the driveway in the car and I said, you have to go in, you have to go in. Can't wait out here. And they were all crying. And I said, you can keep crying, but we still have to go in. It'll be worse tomorrow if you don't go. So they all took a deep breath, and we went in and met Mrs. Danziger, the headmistress, and had a cup of tea there. Looking back at that, I don't know how the girls did it, but they did. They just went back to school, and that would have been very hard on them and very hard on the school people, because the basic problem is nobody knows what to say to you. And because they don't know what to say to you, they keep away from you. They don't want to upset you by saying anything. And so I said to Mrs. Dandridge, I think I better go and speak to the school. And so she organised, what would we call it? It was a service where they played some nice music, a Thanksgiving service for Marguerite, because she'd been the president of the Parents Association and been at the school for many years. So they organised this Thanksgiving service and played some nice music. And at the end of it all, I climbed up on the stage and spoke to the school and said, look, we really need your help. We can't do this alone. And I said, don't be afraid of us, because you're going to walk up and say something and we're going to burst into tears. We'll burst into tears anyway. And we're in a state of shock, and we don't remember who your name is. We'll be really vague, We're just in shock, but we need your help. Please don't run away. That's what I said. And people didn't. They organised all sorts of, food deliveries, from within the school, within the Parents Association, because they knew we didn't, we weren't cooking any meals. So people turned up every night and provided meals for us for months. And people took us out and invited us out to dinner, and that would have been really hard for them, really hard. And I think if the girls hadn't had that support, it would have been much harder for them.
I was sitting there that day when you
really?
Came up on the stage.
Yeah.
And it was 30 years ago.
Yes.
And I can't tell you how many times I've repeated the words that you said. I would say 100 times in the last 30 years, in the context of interviewing people about grief and writing about grief and loss in all different ways. And I remember you standing there saying, please don't be afraid of us.
I think what you're afraid of is you don't know what to say. Yeah. And what can you say? I mean, seriously.
You gave everyone
if you
permission.
go up and say some dumb thing like, well, how are you? The other person who's grieving can say, I feel absolutely terrible. What do you mean? My mother just died. So you think up what you would say to them. And that's the difficulty, because there's nothing really the other people can say to you that's going to stop the pain you're in at that moment. After
Marguerite died, I was thinking that there were 4 things that were going on for you that were all so massive, and yet you had to deal with them simultaneously. You had to take care of 3 grieving little girls. You had to process your own grief about losing your wife. You had to think about who the hell did this. And then you also were under a cloud of suspicion yourself, because whenever anyone's murdered in their own home particularly, the police look at the person closest.
90% of murders do turn out to be somebody who's very close to the person who's killed.
And she had no enemies, and then it was, did you come home at lunchtime? Was it possible? Yeah. And then the gossip started.
That's right. Random killings are pretty rare. Since I knew I didn't do it, I didn't actually think too much about that, right? I was too involved in trying to resurrect my life, right, and re-establish it. And this came out of my past. So when I said I seem to have all the information on how to handle this, I fell back on my knowledge of coaching and sports psychology, which I'd become heavily interested in when I did over a decade of coaching rugby. And I know it sounds incredible. I remember standing outside the church on the Thanksgiving service, and people saying, what are you going to do? And I said, well, obviously I'm just going to start again. And they sort of would look at me and say, what? And I said, yeah, we start again, we're going back, and we're carrying on like nothing happened. And they said, what? You can't do that. You have to go away into a house, have a holiday, go and find an island or do something, And I said, no, that's not how you handle it. Simply put, we're the wallabies, we planned to win the game. The game's just started, and the All Blacks have scored a try. So what do you say? What do you do next? Give up, or what do you do? And there is you could call it a formal procedure, but there is a step-by-step process in sports psychology on how you handle the pressure of sport, and it applies to life exactly the same way. Simply, in sports psychology, you say to the player, number one, you have to ignore the environment, because if he's distracted by the crowd, or he doesn't like the field, or he doesn't like the change shed, or some sort of thing like that, which is the environment, he won't be able to focus on the game. So you have to keep your mind inside the white lines. Ignore the environment, the weather. Okay. So for us, that was it. The house was the environment. We had to ignore the fact that this thing had happened in the house. Okay. The next thing you say to the player, you can't blame anybody. So when somebody scores a try, you can't run up to the fullback and kick him in the head and say, you just missed that tackle, mate. Now we're behind. So everybody's to blame. So no one's to blame. It's just happened.
But in this case, one person was really to blame.
Yes, but if you focus on that, that's negative, and you can't get ahead because you're thinking too much about where you're putting the blame. You're all sort of responsible for what's going on. So in a team, you say you can't blame somebody for something that's happened, otherwise the teamwork breaks down, which leads to the next thing. You have to get back together as a team to play as a team. The next point is you have to focus simply on what you have to do next. So if you're playing set point in the tennis for the Wimbledon and you've got one serve left and you're down 10 points, 40 love or something, the only thing you're focusing on is just serve it over the net. Get rid of the score, get rid of the environment, and just focus on hitting it exactly as you've done before, over the net, into the court, and then hit the net shot back whenever the guy hits it. So we sort of said, we applied this to ourselves and said, okay, well, this event's happened, okay, we ignore the environment, that's the house, we'll go back and treat it as if it's normal. We're not going to let that distract us. We're not blaming anybody. If we waste our time blaming somebody, we just get down to the level they're at and we're distracted and we can't focus on what we're doing. So no blaming. In our case, we didn't know who to blame, so how could you blame somebody? So that left that out of it. The next thing was just focus on what you have to do next. We're doing exactly the same as we did before. Serve the ball over the net, or jump over the hurdle, or whatever it was you have to do. You just have to go and do it. So we're carrying on as normal. We're going to try and run our lives as if nothing's happened.
I remember being 17 and being obsessed with who did it.
Right. Well, we weren't thinking that. We were struggling too much to survive. We couldn't focus. We didn't know who had done it. There was no evidence. There was no clues. There was nothing. And this was a sort of mystic thing. It was like a lightning bolt had gone through the window in the house and killed somebody inside and disappeared. And the chance of that was happening was so remote, you had to say, well, God had something to do with it.
But didn't you feel scared, and didn't the girls feel scared that if we don't know who did this and how it happened, like there's some security that comes with solving a mystery, yes, without wanting to trivialise it. Like the randomness of it and the seeming randomness of it felt very scary. I know it felt scary to everyone who heard about it because she didn't have enemies, it was the middle of the day, it was her own house. Yeah. How can that just happen?
Well, we sort of surmised that somebody must have been in the house doing a robbery and she'd walked into the house, and we had an explanation for how that would have happened, but still it was random.
So you had a story that you told yourself. We had a story
that we could, which turned out to be, pretty well close to the truth, that the guy climbs in upstairs, she drives in downstairs, switches off an alarm, walks in the house, shuts the door, he's upstairs, she's downstairs, and then they collide somewhere in the middle of the house. Now that's quite feasible, right? That's what we think happened. But in our case, we were struggling to survive, so wasting your time thinking about what might have happened and all sorts of scenarios was just a waste of energy. It's again like in the sports psychology, thinking about the score is a waste of energy. It's a kick-off, go and do the kick-off and get the ball back. That's what you're thinking about. So we converted that to our life, and we said, right, well, we have to get up to school this morning and do that. We're doing that, right? I'll pick you up at 3. We'll do that. We're doing this. We felt terrible in the process, but that was the plot. The other thing in the sports psychology that you have to do is the player has to do, he has to motivate himself to want to do it. He has to have some drive inside himself as to why he wants to go back into the battle. There's something worthwhile.
Were the girls your motivation?
Yeah. Well, my case, it was the girls. I was responsible for the girls, but they had to get some sort of motivation as to why they wanted to do that. So we sat around within 24 hours and had a discussion about literally where we were in life with the girls in the room, and came to the conclusion that we were in a pretty difficult situation. And this was really, could seriously affect us and our long-term lives and our relationships with each other and all that sort of stuff. And like in the team, if you have disunity in the team when you're behind on the scoreboard, you're not going to win, right? You have to have everybody in there going for it. So we said, this is the difficulties we've got. We'll all have arguments. We don't want any of that. That causes disruption, disunity. If somebody gets somebody upset, that's going to be a problem. You'll be crying, they'll be crying, so nobody's going to do that. Don't upset your sisters. Don't do this. Focus on what you have to do. And so we sat down and sort of had this discussion about how we would try and live our life. And they pretty well followed it.
Without prying into the girls' lives, everyone processes grief differently.
Yeah.
Did you have to adapt your approach to the 3 different girls?
That's a very, very interesting question, because they obviously grieved, and they did it probably mostly privately by, they go to their room and cry and then come back again, and you wouldn't know what had happened, right? They just got on and did it as if it was relatively normal. Now, occasionally they went off to see some sort of counsellor, and they, I don't know how effective they were really, because in those days people really didn't know what to say. The attitude we'd taken to it, I think, was unusual. There's nothing we can do about this, and we're either going to get bogged down in the event, or we're going to get out of it. And the only way to get out of it is to accept it and go on. And they largely did that. They went back to school. They got 90 percentiles in the HSC. They didn't run off the rails. They turned up at sport the next day. Immediately I'd said that's what we're going to do, and they'd gone along with the plan. I don't know what the plan otherwise would be, really. What do? Sit at home all day and don't do anything.
What were the times when Margie's absence was its most pronounced over the girls' lives, I imagine?
Getting married would have been difficult for them, and it was difficult for me because I had to do it all by myself 3 times. But they were strong. They didn't make an issue of it. And that was the other point. In the sports psychology, when you're behind the try line and the guy scores the goal, scores the try, and you blame the fullback for missing the tackle, you're in the blame situation. And once you start blaming things, you're a victim of the event. So we said, life's going to be really difficult, and we start to blame something, we've got an excuse. So let's make a rule that we're never blaming your mother's death as to why you can't do something. Because if you do that, you're the victim. And they never did.
You make it sound like it was easy, and that also it was just quite progressive and linear. I imagine there were dark moments and dark times. And were you back on the floor ever again?
Oh, yes. The Epiphany experience gave me a feeling that I was plugged into this powerful source that was empowering me and that I could cope. And that was internal. That was like deep in your consciousness and deep inside yourself. And on the outside, your body's racked with pain. And you're fighting the difficulties of trying to manage your life while the ship's going down or is sinking. And that's painful. And there are only two feelings. There's this euphoric feeling of being plugged in and you can cope. But it was counterbalanced by this horrendous pain and emotion. And you'd be going around and, you'd open a cupboard and see some, piece of clothing belonging to Marguerite. You'd fall on the floor and burst into tears, racked with pain. So it wasn't, it looked easy. It wasn't easy. It was horrendously difficult. But there was this sort of force seemed to be driving me, and doors were opening in a spiritual sense in all sorts of directions. For example, somebody came up, a stranger, and said, "Oh, look, I've heard this has happened to you. How terrible. Here's a phone number and a piece of paper. Ring this person, he might be able to help." Now, at that point, this is like 6 weeks after Marguerite's death, I'm walking around looking for an answer. I want to get through this suffering that we're all going through. And I'm consciously looking for a solution to it, which is a bit unusual. And I want to get out of it, because I'm saying to myself, well, I don't get out of it, how can I live my life? How can the girls live their life if we're stuck in this mire? So I'm looking for a solution. I'm going from person to person. Start with psychologists, start with doctors. Oh, there's somebody who's amazing with fixing people and healing people. I'd go and see some stranger. She'd be a tarot card reader or something or other, and so on. And I went anywhere and everywhere to try and find somebody who would provide a solution for me on how you got through the suffering, how you get out of it. And this person turns up, and the stranger in the street, and says, "Here's a phone number, ring this guy." I said, "Who's that?" And he said, "Oh, he's a meditation teacher." The guy turns out to live 100 yards away. I would never have gone if he was at North Shore. He's 100 yards away in Jersey Road. Mm. So I go round and I see the guy, and he says, "What do you want?" And I said, "I'm looking for a way out of my suffering." He said, "I can help you." I said, "Really? You're the first person in many. How can you help me?" He said, "I'll teach you to meditate." And I said, "Okay, I'll do this. I'm open to anything. If you say you can help me, I'll do it." Now, I knew nothing about meditation. I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. So I go round there, and he teaches me to meditate, and I have some very deep spiritual experiences, and I immediately feel better. I feel sort of more detached, more back inside myself, less shattered. My mind felt calmer. I felt more grounded on the ground. So I said, well, this is pretty good. So this guy's 100 yards from me. So I virtually live in his house every day, doing meditation with him and learning more techniques and getting involved in meditation, transcendental meditation it was. And then I started to feel dramatically different.
Over what period of time?
Oh, literally, within weeks, days. I could feel the effect of the meditation.
But how long after Marguerite's death?
That was 6 weeks. It took me 6 weeks to find that. 6 weeks to find this guy. So I've been looking seriously for 6 weeks for an answer to how to get through, the grieving process and restructure my consciousness or mind to where I was. And that then tied in with this pursuit of God, because the epiphany experience was saying to me, there's something here that you never really were aware of, and it felt real. I mean, it wasn't imagined. I just couldn't believe that I wasn't drinking, taking drugs, having alcohol. I was going to work. The children were turning up at school. Everybody was behaving relatively normally, right? They were crying and they were sad, but they weren't unmanageable. And there's only one parent in this event that happened to their life. If you added everything up, they should have all been sitting at home, demented, going out of their brains and not doing schoolwork and all this stuff, and you wouldn't be going to work. And yet you were doing it. And I was putting the answer to that, to this connection with this force, which I call love or divine or God.
5 years after Marguerite died, someone was charged with her murder.
Yes.
How did that impact upon your processing of the whole experience?
In part of the mystery of the journey that forced me more and more inwards was the fact that it was unresolved. And there was no explanation for 5 years. Absolutely no explanation for 5 years.
A lifetime.
And so this was frustrating, as you could imagine. And there was the other issues, it sort of broke up my partnership in the practice. And, the other partner who sort of said, I think we should...
The orthodontist practice.
Yeah, the other orthodontist. We'd been in partnership for 17 years, right? Now, this is interesting. I only thought this up the other day, and I spoke to him. And he's felt really guilty all these years for breaking up the partnership in my moment of need. And I said to him the other day, it was his birthday, we were 5 days apart. He was a Taurus, I was a Taurus. We had a fantastic relationship for 17 years. We never had so much fun with two people. It was like cats and Jama kids at work. It was terrific. And then this happens, Marguerite gets killed. He says, I think we should break up the partnership. I said, look, I don't care. Whatever you want to do, it doesn't matter. He said, right, and off we went. It retrospectively turns out to be the best thing we could have done. And it would have been really hard for him to do it. He did it for the wrong reasons, but it was the right thing to do because I was in such a sort of distracted state I couldn't work in it, and we couldn't adjust the finances properly, and would have been chaos. So it turned out it was better for me to be on my own. I could work when I wanted to, not work, read religious books, disappear, whatever, right? And I couldn't have done that in a partnership. So retrospectively, he took the hard road by breaking it up, and he's felt guilty ever since. And I told him the other day that he shouldn't feel guilty. So the unknowingness and all those other things which were happening, the 5 years of not knowing, forced me deeper and deeper into meditation, to go further and further into religion, into Buddhism, karma, all these sorts of things. What on earth was happening here in life, right? How could I make sense? Now, that's my way of doing it. Psychologists say in order to cope with anything, the only way we can cope is to make some meaning in it. And you can make whatever meaning you want. There is no meaning that you have to say everybody has to go and find God. You might find something else that is meaningful for you, right? That comes out of it. The other thing that I was doing retrospectively was I was trying to find something good in something which was a bad experience.
Were the police keeping you updated?
Yeah.
Did they have leads?
No, there was no leads. That was it. It was like as I said, it was like a lightning bolt had gone through the window, and he killed this person and gone out, and there was no fingerprints, nothing. There was a drop of blood, but essentially there was no evidence that they could follow. And
did you have theories in your own mind apart from the robbery?
we had no theories because there was nothing that had happened. I mean, like literally, we just walked into the house, and is this person dead in the house? And there's no fingerprints, sign of break or enter, no real violence, a bit of blood here, there. What on earth happened? It didn't make sense. What was she doing in the bedroom? How did he get into the house? The alarm was on. All those sorts of things. It just, and they naturally thought it must be somebody she knew.
Because and you went through everyone that you could think of.
So they went through everybody. Probably the worst thing of that was, I said, well, look, this looks like some sort of emotional relationship. Did she have any, other of your male friends that she was attracted to? Who did she like, etc., etc.? I said, my God, are you joking? She wasn't like that, and that was really quite painful to sort of go through lists of phone books and say, well, which guy might she have looked at twice, and he's turned up and misread something. Anyway, that didn't happen. But
how did you find out that they had a lead in the end?
Well, again, it's part of the bizarre, I use the word mystic. So the guy commits the crime here, goes to Brisbane, breaks in up there a week later, gets arrested. He's on parole, so they send him back and put him into Long Bay Jail. So 3 weeks later, the guy's in Long Bay Jail.
3 weeks after he killed Marguerite.
Yeah, after Marguerite. For breaking parole, because he killed her when he was on parole. He was deemed fit to come into society, by the parole board. So he's back in Long Bay Jail. Well, of course, everybody's looking for somebody. They're not looking in jail for him. I mean, this is incredible. So, we've given up. We said divine justice will do this. We can't be bothered with, the police investigation because there was nothing to investigate. No leads, nothing. So the guy's in jail for 5 years. And then Neville Wran, who was the Premier, introduced the prison informant scheme, because he said everybody in prison knows what's going on, so we'll pay prisoners for information. So this guy stands up and says, oh, look, I know who killed this woman. It was this other guy, and I've heard all about it. So he goes to the police in the prison and tells them he knows who's killed this woman. And they say, oh, that's all very interesting. What proof do you have? You know, you could be just reading the newspaper, making it up. And he says, oh, well, I've got some of the items that were, you know, stolen from the place. And the police said, oh, that's really interesting, because we don't have anything on a list. And he said, I've got this bracelet, which he'd taken off Marguerite, but since I didn't know she was wearing it, I didn't know it was missing, right? So he produces the bracelet, and then they bring me the bracelet, and then we go off and confirm, yes, that's the bracelet, which matched a necklace. Okay, so this guy's got the bit of jewellery. And then he says, I've got this gun that the guy hit the woman with on the head. And they said, really? Yeah, it's in the box, actually, in your police station. You took it. So he produces this evidence that ties him to the crime. And he writes
on the basis that he's pretending that someone else had done it.
He then writes a long dissertation in pencil, which he crosses out numerous times, about 17 pages, about what happened on the day. And he gives
Is this guy the dumbest criminal ever?
He gives this to the police. The police connect with the Mossad in Israel, their intelligence service, and said, we've got this description here by this guy. Can your experts look at it and tell us what they think? So they go through it and they say the person who wrote it was either there or did it. Right? We think most likely he did it. There's all sorts of clues in, for example, there's 17 pages of writing and 10 pages describe where he was in the time of the event being done. So every second is accounted for for his alibi time, which is disproportionate to the whole events of the day. So that's a sort of giveaway. What's he covering up in here? Anyway, that pointed the finger at the guy. So they say, well, there's something suspicious here. Okay, so they then said to him, well, the guy you've accused, he's a real criminal. We know who he is. Yes, he's violent. Yes, the way you've described it could happen. Let's investigate him. So they take him out of jail, put him into Bondi Motel, call up his mate, they have a few beers, but he doesn't say anything. He doesn't bring up the subject. Well, obviously he's not going to, because the other guy had nothing to do with it. He was meant to say, listen, Joe, you're in a lot of trouble, or I'm in a lot of trouble, and the other guy would then say back, don't say anything about that, and then he'd be caught. He doesn't discuss it. So they go, well, look, that doesn't look too good. And the bloke says, yeah, I was a bit afraid he might hit me. And the police said, what do you mean? The place was surrounded by police. You could have told him. Nothing happens. Then another informer in the jail comes to the police and said, listen, I'm talking to this guy in the showers and he's telling me he's mixed up in this crime. I said, oh, okay. So they put a wiretap on this other prisoner. He goes back and talks to the original guy. And in the course of the conversation, the guy admits that he did it. So then they go back to him in jail and they say, listen, we've got you on a wiretap. You didn't confront your mate. You had the jewellery, you had the weapon.
Literally, he had the gun.
Yeah, had the gun, yeah. And we've got a drop of blood. And the guy says, oh, how'd you get that? And he said, well, we found a towel in the house and it's got some blood. It must, we just want to make sure it's not your blood. This was in the days before DNA, and you weren't allowed to sort of take bodily fluids from prisoners or people. But the police said to him, look, the best thing you can do is give us some of your blood and it'll cross you off the list. Right? And he didn't know whose blood it was. So he gives them his blood, and it was his blood. So that put him inside the house. He had the weapon, he had the jewellery.
He'd confessed to the crime.
No, he never confessed. He had the story. Everything everything he said failed, right, on investigation. and the jury found him guilty. So you could almost say it was like circumstantial evidence in a way, because he never actually confessed to doing it.
Were you in the court?
Yeah.
The girls were there?
Yeah, we took 8 weeks off to watch it.
And what was it like sitting in there with him every day?
Terrible. It was hearing descriptions of what happened, seeing the guy sitting there, and then the greatest pain was not knowing whether he could be found guilty. It's very difficult to prove guilt for murder, because murder has to have the extra perspective that at some point in the confrontation with the other person, you stop and deliberately decide to kill them. So manslaughter is you have a fight and somebody's killed. But in murder, you have to have that moment where there was, yes, the person was on the floor and then I went back and shot them. So there has to be a deliberate intent.
And motive.
And motive to do it, right? Whereas manslaughter, you can have a fight with somebody and then they're killed. And you say, well, in the heat of the moment, I didn't intend to kill them, but I threw a punch and he was killed. So murder is technically difficult to prove.
And the motive was proven to be that she recognised him.
Well, they think that she had amazing memory. So
how long before had he been here as a trades?
About 12 months.
Tiler on the roof.
About 12 months.
Do you remember him?
No, because I was never home when they were working. So whether she remembered him or not, or whether they just met as a shock on the floor, he threw a punch, they had a fight, whatever it was, then he panicked and then said, well, look, what do I do now, or something or other, and then he decides to kill him, right? So...
Did you want to just leap over the table and
throttle
not really.
him? No.
Punch him in the face?
I'm not like that. He did that from his level of consciousness, which was basically fear, I suppose. I just wouldn't do that.
You sound so accepting.
Well, I think that's what happened to me after the epiphany, and we had no other choice but to accept, what had happened.
Did the girls feel angry being in that courtroom with him, or scared?
Yeah, they used to sing a song or something. They used to sing this song to him. The police or something. I'm watching you.
Every step you take, every move you make.
So they'd all sit there together and go, every step you take, and they'd sort of sing this little song which you could hear. The police were watching you,
Wow.
And the guy was there. Now, there was some sort of like mysteries about how this was all exposed, where after the conviction, we all go outside, and the jury all came out, and they're not meant to discuss the internal discussions. Anyway, some guy comes up to me and he says, I'm so glad we got that guy. And I said, oh yes, and I said, and how did you draw the conclusion that he was guilty? And I didn't realise you weren't meant to ask that, and he wasn't meant to tell me. And he said, oh, it was really easy. I knew he was guilty, and so did a couple of the other people. I said, how did you know that? I said, oh, well, in his evidence, he said that he spent the afternoon before the event. He gave several versions. One was his mate did the crime entirely, but he went to help him out afterwards because the guy had then panicked he'd killed the woman. The second version was they both did the job. His mate went inside the house, met the woman, killed her, and he was outside as the getaway driver, right? So he had that and then he couldn't explain how his blood got inside the house, and his explanation for that was, oh well, I went in to clean up, the mess after my mate came out and said, I've killed this woman, and the judge said to him, well, how would you know where he'd been? What did you wipe down? What part of the house did you wipe down? And because that was dumb, because he wouldn't know, right? So, talking to the jury guy says to me, oh, several of us went down to the hotel in Devonshire Street called the Excelsior. We went up to the bar where he said he was hanging around on the roof, and we looked around, and we looked up the weather, and he said it was like about 4 degrees and there was 30 knots of southwesterly wind, and he said you could not have sat out on that, that upstairs bar out in the open for 3 hours like he said he did. So we knew he was lying. I said, but you're not meant to do that. He said, well, we went off to see what he was talking about. So, it was interesting that these guys in the jury saw that as the point, Nobody else knew what would have happened, and they decided, right, the guy's guilty. The evidence all pointed to him. His stories were just constant lies. Every story changed. The drop of blood put him inside the house. But he never actually admitted, and he's dead now. He died 3 or 4 years ago in prison. He never actually admitted that he actually did it, except on the tape when he says to the guy in the informer in the prison. The guy says, "Well, did you do it?" Yeah, probably. I suppose I did.
You said after the verdict that you didn't hate him. You were asked by a journalist.
No, hating and putting down other people is a negative experience, and it just makes you negative. It's also sort of victimisation, right? We were looking for something good, and I'd found something that was amazingly good, some sort of understanding of religion, spirituality, and what that meant, and love. I'd had an amazing life with Marguerite. This had happened, and I could see a spiritual goodness in what had happened. So that was a trade-off.
Is she still here in this house, do you think?
I don't know. I've never really had a feeling of, oh yes, she's there around the corner, right? Except the place is amazingly calm, and it's very uplifting. So, and it's consciousness we love. So, if she's here, that's here, right? Admittedly, the other night I was looking up something, and I turned everything off, and I was looking up my manuscript, reading about what had happened 20 years ago, and I suddenly felt like something was there. This only happened last week. Something was there, and I turned around to look. Now, I shouldn't have done that because the house is empty, so why would I look for something that wasn't there? There's nothing in the house. I don't go around, oh, is there somebody in the next room, And so I'm sitting there, and I kept getting this funny, like, shivering feeling, like there was something there, and I'd look around. And I was reading the manuscript, I sort of thought, I said to Brianna, oh, that happened. She said, oh, that happens to me all the time. I've never really thought of her being present in a conscious way, walking around. I'd never done that. I've just sort of felt connected with her, and that was it.
Could you ever leave this house, do you think?
Could I ever leave it? I suppose I can when the right moment turns up. At the moment, it's a hotel for the family, right? The people coming down from the bush, the grandparents and all that sort of thing. So I'm constantly making beds and cleaning things up and changing things around, and then they move in and stay a week and then go away. So at the moment, it has a family functional use. It's perfect for me at the moment. At some point, if it gets too big to manage, then I'd say, right, I have to move on.
I often park in this street.
Oh, yes.
Going to a restaurant nearby or the shops, and every time I think of you, and every time I look at the house, and I never thought that you would still be there, but I was always wondering what had happened to you. And I guess, like so many people who were either in your orbit at the time or read about the story, I've always wondered if you were okay. And I have my answer now. Yeah,
that's what I see in her. She sacrificed her life for us to have this experience.
Like post-traumatic growth.
Like she says the night before, our life is too perfect. So this was August the 1st, and we're having dinner, and the kids have gone to bed, and we're reading the Wentworth Courier, and it's describing some babysitter down in Rose Bay, and these people break in, got the wrong house, and tie up the babysitter and terrify the children, and then realise they're in the wrong house and rush off. And we're saying, oh my God, that's terrible, isn't that terrible? And she says to me, nothing's ever happened to us. Our life is too perfect. That's the night before she's going to get killed. And I say, well, we work really hard at keeping it right, sort of thing. What an odd thing to say. When you say this is sort of, I can't verify this other than what the girls told me, because I didn't see this. You'll hear why. Didn't see this. But when I walked in after finding Marguerite's body to the house next door, and the children were sitting in there, it was like 7 o'clock, and they were in the kitchen somewhere sitting. And I walk in, and I say, and they're sitting on a couch, and I'm standing up, and I'm looking down, and I say, this is the worst thing I'll ever have to tell you in my life. The worst thing. Your mother's dead. And I didn't know how else I was going to say it. I didn't say she's been killed by anyone. I said she's dead. We don't know what happened. She's dead. Somebody's hit her on the head. They just all screamed. There's this one scream. And then it stops, and they just sit there. And they don't burst into tears, they don't do anything, they just sit there. Now, they've all told me afterwards, not some years later, we were discussing this, and I said, well, what do you remember about that? And they said also the same thing. They said, all we could see was this light in your eyes. Your eyes was like 7 o'clock at night. Your eyes, you know, sometimes you see people's eyes and they seem to be, like light seems to be coming out of them. They said, your eyes were just blazing with, there was this light in your eyes. We're just looking at, and your eyes look crystal clear. Mm-hmm. And you were telling. Now, I thought, I told that to some, spiritual person, and he sort of says, well, at some point you were transmitting something to them through the light. They honestly didn't behave like children who'd had their mother murdered for the rest of their lives. They just got on and did what was necessary. They weren't we didn't come home and have arguments. They weren't crying. They weren't not doing their homework. I mean, Askin was terrific for that because they had the Dalton scheme and they had to sort of follow the regime. And so if you followed the regime, you kept up. And they just did it. They just did it.
You were two parents to them from that point, from that moment.
They might have, I think a lot of it may be that we don't want to let Dad down. If we step off the rails, he'll go off the rails. We can't do that. So we'll have to keep, on the straight and narrow, which was an enormous effort for them. And that, they've all got good marriages, 3 kids, degrees, done really well with their lives, far better than you would think most people who run off the rails. I think most of society is running around taking drugs and running off the rails simply lack the courage to face up to what they're doing, and they blame other people for their situation instead of getting off their own 2 feet and fixing themselves up. Like Jordan Peterson says, life is difficult. That's what Scott Peck, The Road Less Travelled, line 1. Have you ever read that book?
Absolutely.
Yeah, discipline. Discipline is hard. Having to go and do your homework when you don't want to do it is hard. What enables you to do that? That's the love. The moment anything's difficult, it's the love that's within you that makes you do it, or you don't do it.
I've learnt so much from you today. Iain, thank you.
Are we there?
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this episode of No Filter. It was such an incredible privilege to go into the Edwards home and to be in that, I would really call it a sacred space. Before we started recording the interview, Iain wanted to play us some music and he made us a beautiful cup of tea and he had some biscuits laid out. And he suggested that we do a short meditation. And we did. And it was just the most moving experience, an interesting experience talking to him. And I send all my love to Iain and to Sky, Camilla and Brianna. What an incredible dad you have, and what an incredible credit to your mum. All 3 of you are. If you're after something else to listen to, you might want to listen to that interview I did with Lee Sales that kicked this whole interview off. We'll pop a link in our show notes. And also, if you or anyone you know has gone through grief or sudden loss, buy her book, Any Ordinary Day. It's absolutely incredible and, again, a really moving and uplifting read in a strange way. No Filter is produced by Eliza Ratliff, my Lies, who was with me when we recorded this interview. I'm Mia Friedman. You can find me on Instagram @Mia Friedman, and I will see you on Mamma Mia.